The call that started it all. It was the kind of morning that felt too quiet. That was my first red flag, July 25th, 2019. I remember the stillness in the White House corridors, like the place was holding its breath. Now, to be clear, mornings in D.C. are usually filled with the low murmur of strategy calls, coffee-fueled interns rushing about like caffeinated ants, and the occasional deep sigh from a communications director trying not to scream. But that day, silence, like someone had pulled a blanket over the building and dared it to make a sound. Then came the call. President Donald Trump picked up the phone for a scheduled conversation with Ukraine's newly elected president, Volodymyr Zelensky. You'd think it was just another routine diplomatic gesture. You know, the usual congratulations and let's strengthen relations sort of thing. But this call, this wasn't just a chat. It would set off a constitutional alarm loud enough to wake James Madison from the grave. Now, I didn't hear the call live. Neither did most of us. But those who did, let's just say, a few stomachs dropped faster than approval ratings in a scandal. A handful of people in the White House Situation Room listened in, and apparently, when the line was disconnected, they just sort of blinked, slowly, like they couldn't quite process what they'd heard. The core issue was this: Trump had asked Zelensky for a favor. That favor involved digging up dirt on Joe Biden, his political rival, and Biden's son, Hunter. At the time, Hunter was serving on the board of a Ukrainian gas company called Burisma. And let's just say Burisma had more controversy swirling around it than a Bravo reality show reunion. Historians still debate whether Trump's language amounted to a direct quid pro quo. Did he condition U.S. military aid nearly $400 million on this political favor? Or was it just Trump being Trump, vague and improving his way through foreign policy? The transcript, well, let's call it a rough memorandum, because that's what it technically was, would later be released to the public. That document read like a spy novel written by someone who flunked out of diplomacy school but aced theater class. There were oddities, references to CrowdStrike and a mysterious server. It was as if Trump's foreign policy briefing had been conducted via Reddit. At this point, I need to drop a historical fact for the soul. Presidential phone calls with foreign leaders are normally confidential. They're rarely, if ever, released. It's sort of like Vegas. What happens in the call stays in the call. Until this one. Because pressure started to build. Someone inside the intelligence community had filed a whistleblower complaint. And here's your bizarre tidbit of the day. That complaint almost didn't reach Congress. For a brief, strange moment, the acting director of national intelligence, Joseph McGuire, refused to forward it, citing executive privilege, which, for the record, is like someone finding a fire, calling the fire department, and the fire chief saying, "Nah, let's not tell anyone. It's probably fine." Now back to the White House. The transcript of the call was originally stored in a highly classified system, a server usually reserved for the country's deepest secrets, nuclear codes, black ops, that kind of thing. So why was a phone call with Ukraine shoved into that cyber fortress? The official line was sensitive material. Critics called it a cover-up. Supporters said it was overblown. Meanwhile, the rest of us were just trying to figure out how this reality show of a presidency had managed to jump the shark again. I remember sitting with a colleague in a DC cafe the day the rough transcript was released. The look on her face when she read it, it was a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. Like she'd just binge-watched 3 seasons of a political drama and realized it wasn't fiction. I think she actually whispered, "He really said that." And I just nodded, chewing on a bagel that suddenly tasted like stress. You have to understand, Ukraine wasn't just any country. It was, and still is, embroiled in a conflict with Russia, desperately needing U.S. support. They were counting on us. And here was the President of the United States allegedly leveraging that need for personal political gain. It wasn't just a bad look. It was a potential abuse of power dressed up in diplomatic casual wear. But let's pause for 1 second and appreciate this gem. Someone once tried to defend the call by comparing it to locker room talk between buddies. Now, I don't know what kind of locker rooms they've been in, but mine never included discussions about geopolitics and international corruption probes. As the day wore on, the air in Washington got thick with speculation. Would this really lead to impeachment? We'd been down that road before, remember Mueller. But this felt different, sharper, more immediate, less about past sins and more about the present danger of unchecked power. By the end of that week, people were whispering about impeachment in actual hallways, not just the cable news pundits, lawmakers, staffers. Even the mailroom guy raised an eyebrow and said, "So, this could be it." The whistleblower complaint was still being hidden at this point, but word was out. The call was real. The transcript was bizarre. And for the first time in a long time, the I word wasn't just floating in the distance, it was knocking on the front door. And we weren't sure if we should answer. Whistleblowers and whispered warning. I still remember where I was when the whistleblower complaint broke the surface. It was one of those moments where the room gets quieter, but your mind gets louder. I was sitting in my tiny, over-caffeinated office, scrolling through news alerts, half expecting more celebrity feuds or avocado toast inflation updates. But then, bam, headline after headline about a whistleblower inside the intelligence community claiming that something deeply troubling had happened. And it all circled back to that now infamous Ukraine call. It started out vague, like most Washington leaks do. An urgent concern had been filed. That phrase alone was enough to raise eyebrows. In bureaucratic lingo, urgent concern is not code for my feelings are hurt. It's serious. It means someone inside the national security structure believes laws may have been broken, or at the very least violated in spirit. The acting director of national intelligence at the time, Joseph McGuire, found himself smack in the middle of it. He refused initially to hand the complaint over to Congress. Now that's not normal. By law, the complaint should have gone directly to the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. Instead, the Department of Justice stepped in like an overprotective big brother, whispering something about executive privilege and legal gray areas. Spoiler alert, legal gray areas are where political careers go to retire. The whistleblower, still anonymous, still under threat. But their complaint was eventually released, and reading it was like watching a slow-motion train wreck narrated by someone far too calm for the moment. The complaint described not just the call itself, but the way White House officials scrambled to bury it afterward. Notes from the call weren't stored normally. They were moved to a classified system designed for state secrets. That alone sounded more like damage control than protocol. Historians still debate whether this maneuver was a security necessity or a digital broom sweeping dirt under the rug. Here's a fun, totally unnecessary historical fact. The first whistleblower protection law in the United States was passed in 1778 during the Revolutionary War. Back then, a couple of sailors reported their commanding officer for torturing British prisoners. So, whistleblowing is basically as American as apple pie and questionable decisions. Anyway, as the complaint became public, the mood in D.C. shifted from cautious curiosity to full-on political earthquake. Democrats in the House who'd been skittish about launching another impeachment after the Mueller investigation fizzled like a damp firework, suddenly had something solid. This wasn't tangled in years of legalese or based on classified briefings no one could discuss. This was a phone call, a document, and a whistleblower saying, "Hey, this is not okay." Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who had been slow walking the impeachment talk like someone trying not to trigger a tripwire, finally pulled the pin. On September 24th, 2019, she stood in front of the cameras and used the word impeachment. Her voice was calm, but the message thundered. No one is above the law. Cue the usual political theater. Republicans cried foul, called it a witch hunt again, and argued that the president had done nothing wrong. Some even said the call was perfect. Which, look, I don't know about you, but if someone describes a political phone call as perfect, I immediately assume it was not. I had friends on both sides of the aisle, and I remember one of them, a career staffer with an impressive collection of presidential mugs, texting me, "This is bad, really bad." I asked if they meant politically or legally. They just replied, "Yes." At this point, the whistleblower's identity was still being protected like a national treasure. Conspiracy theories swirled. Was it a Democrat plant? A disloyal spy? A disgruntled staffer with a grudge? None of the above, most likely. But that didn't stop a wave of online sleuths from trying to unmask them. Some with the digital subtlety of a hammer in a library. And here's your bizarre, completely unnecessary fact for this section. Did you know that the CIA once tried to use a fake cat with a microphone surgically implanted in its ear to spy on Soviet officials? The project was called Acoustic Kitty. It failed spectacularly when the cat ran into traffic during its first mission. True story. The lesson here, government secrets and cats don't mix. And also, sometimes the weirdest parts of U.S. intelligence history aren't even the most controversial. Back to 2019. By now, the White House was on defense fast. They tried to downplay the call attack the whistleblower and claim that releasing the rough transcript proved their innocence. But the problem was, the transcript didn't exactly do them any favors. It was like trying to put out a grease fire with more grease. Then came the denials. Trump said he'd done nothing wrong. Zelensky, awkwardly positioned between two global powers like the world's most anxious wedding guest, also insisted he hadn't felt pressured. But honestly, if your country's entire defense budget depends on U.S. approval, what else are you going to say? It was around this time that quid pro quo became the hottest Latin phrase in America. I haven't seen that much Latin in the news since people tried to make carpe diem a personality trait. The phrase got dissected, reworded, and reframed. Republicans said there was no quid pro quo. Democrats said it was textbook. And most of the public just wanted someone to stop saying Latin on the evening news. And the whistleblower, still out of the spotlight, still protected. Their complaint had done its job, sparked an inquiry, shaken Congress, and thrust impeachment back into the headlines, all without showing their face. By the time the dust settled that week, one thing was clear. This wasn't going away, not like before. This time, lawmakers had a smoking transcript, a credible complaint, and a political clock ticking toward the 2020 election. Everyone was calculating, everyone was watching, and the whispers were now full-on shouts. It wasn't just about what Trump said. It was about how far he was willing to go, and how far the system would bend before it broke. Behind closed doors, the impeachment inquiry begins. The day the impeachment inquiry officially began, you could practically feel Capitol Hill vibrate. Not from any earthquake, though metaphorically sure, but from the rustle of reporters clutching their notepads like lifebuoys, lawmakers rushing to meetings with eyes darting like nervous squirrels, and aides whispering into phones behind hastily closed doors. It felt like history was curling its fingers around the collar of Washington and saying, "Sit down, you're not done yet." The inquiry was launched by 6 House committees, but the action centered on the Intelligence Committee. That's where the hearings started. And for the first few weeks, everything happened behind closed doors. Now, in theory, this was to protect national security. In practice, it just made the whole thing feel like a suspense thriller penned by a committee of lawyers and dramatists. Let me paint the picture for you. You're walking through a hallway in the U.S. Capitol's basement. Yes, the actual basement. Fluorescent lights humming. Damp concrete. A handful of reporters loitering like hungry cats. Then suddenly, a key witness gets whisked into a secure room through a side door, like they're in the witness protection program. You don't know what they're going to say, but everyone's sure it's important. One of the first witnesses was Bill Taylor, the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine. His testimony, oh boy. It was like someone had dropped a jigsaw puzzle onto the table, and suddenly we started seeing the edges form. He described what he called an irregular channel of diplomacy, run not through the State Department, but through Rudy Giuliani Trump's personal lawyer, and a cast of characters who felt more like guests at a shadowy dinner party than formal diplomats. Taylor claimed that military aid to Ukraine and a coveted White House visit were being dangled like prizes in a rigged carnival game. You want the stuffed bear Ukraine, then open an investigation into the Bidens. Historians still debate whether these unofficial diplomatic back channels were unprecedented or just an exaggerated version of every administration's backroom deals. But Taylor's testimony cracked open the door, and more witnesses came spilling through. Next came Fiona Hill, former top Russia advisor. With her sharp British accent and no-nonsense energy, she managed to make C-SPAN feel like a BBC espionage drama. She warned about the dangers of peddling debunked conspiracy theories and described the split between official policy and Giuliani's rogue operation. When she spoke, people listened not just because of her expertise, but because of the clear frustration in her voice, like someone watching a slow-moving disaster that everyone else insisted was fine. Then came Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. Picture a decorated Army officer sitting in uniform, testifying to Congress about a call he'd personally heard and found so alarming he reported it up the chain. His calm demeanor made the accusations hit harder. And also, fun fact, Vindman wore his dress uniform during the hearing, which led to one of the most bizarre debates of the entire inquiry, whether or not it was too much. This in a city where people wear flag pins like armor. Meanwhile, Trump was tweeting constantly. It was like a live commentary track nobody asked for. At one point, he tweeted an attack on former Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch while she was testifying. It was surreal. She was answering questions about being ousted from her post in Ukraine, and boom, a tweet came through criticizing her. The room froze. Then someone read it aloud. You could actually see the ripple move through her face. That moment, it became a weird kind of historical first. A witness reacting in real time to the president's social media barrage during an impeachment hearing. What a time to be alive. The closed-door depositions were technically secure, but the leaks flowed like a faucet installed by interns. We'd get half sentences, confusing quotes, summaries, whispered over coffee. It was like trying to follow a recipe where someone had torn every page in half. But each leak painted a clearer picture pressure on Ukraine back channels run by personal allies, a desire to leverage foreign policy for domestic political gain. And here's your bizarre off-topic fact. At the same time all this was going on, a pigeon in London was arrested. Yes, arrested for espionage. Authorities thought the bird might be carrying coded messages. Turned out, it wasn't. But somehow, a pigeon had better operational security than parts of the White House. Back in the Capitol, Republicans argued that the secret hearings were unfair. They staged a literal invasion of one secure room, barging in with phones they weren't supposed to carry and ordering pizza like it was a frat house. It wasn't exactly 12 angry men, more like 30 angry men with cell phones and C-SPAN dreams. The strategy was clear. Attack the process, discredit the witnesses, question the timing. They claimed the whole inquiry was a political hit job, not a constitutional safeguard. Democrats, meanwhile, tried to stay focused. They knew that public opinion would be everything. And if they wanted this to stick, they had to be surgical, precise, boring even. You could feel the stakes rise each day. I'd get texts from exhausted Hill staffers at 2 a.m. saying things like, "They just dropped another 400 pages of testimony. Kill me." I'd respond with, "Sleep is for the weak." Humor helps when democracy is melting. By the end of October, the dam broke. Democrats announced that public hearings were coming. And suddenly, the whole thing was going to be on television. For weeks, everything had happened in silence, in private, behind locked doors. But now the country was going to hear for itself. No filters, no leaks. Just testimony cameras and a nervous nation watching. What had started with a phone call in July had grown into a full-fledged impeachment inquiry, and we were just getting to the good part: public hearings and private calculations. The morning the public hearings began, I got up early, not because I wanted to, but because my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Journalists, staffers, conspiracy-minded uncles. Everyone had something to say. It felt like a national holiday, hosted by cable news networks. Only instead of balloons and fireworks, we had subpoenas and caffeine-fueled outrage. The hearing room was packed. C-SPAN had its cameras rolling. Twitter was already halfway through a meltdown. The first two witnesses seated before Congress were Bill Taylor and George Kent, both career diplomats who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, but also like they'd been preparing for this moment their entire lives. Taylor had that kind of weary gravitas you can't fake. Kent, with his bow tie and precise diction, came off like the professor who never accepted late homework. They weren't flashy, they weren't political bomb throwers, but that's what made their testimonies hit harder. They didn't sound like partisans. They sounded like people who'd spent their entire adult lives trying to serve their country, and now felt forced to explain how it had veered into something they didn't recognize. And let me tell you, watching those hearings, it felt like America was binge-watching its own nervous breakdown. They laid it out step by step, how aid to Ukraine had been frozen for unexplained reasons, how there was growing pressure to investigate the Bidens, how regular diplomatic channels had been bypassed by a shadow operation run through Rudy Giuliani. It was like peeling back drywall and finding a nest of wires duct taped together by a raccoon with a foreign policy degree. Historians still debate whether Giuliani's role qualifies as backdoor diplomacy or a complete breakdown of executive norms. I lean toward the latter, but hey, I'm just the narrator. By the time Marie Yovanovitch testified, things had reached a boiling point. She'd been ousted from her post as ambassador to Ukraine under murky circumstances, accused of disloyalty without evidence, and smeared in the press. But there she was, composed, dignified, and very clearly not amused. Midway through her testimony, President Trump tweeted criticism about her. Real time. Again, just like before. And this time, Representative Adam Schiff read the tweet aloud during the hearing. I watched Yovanovitch's face closely. She didn't flinch. She just nodded slightly, like a teacher marking down points for bad behavior. This wasn't just politics. It was performance art with a legal undertone. And yet amid the drama, there was something surprisingly dull about parts of it. And that's not an insult. That's how constitutional processes should feel. Stable, measured. But this wasn't normal procedure. It was spectacle laced with anxiety. A strange mix of Watergate flashbacks and live tweeted chaos. Here's a bizarre fact you didn't ask for during the same week of public hearings. A flock of wild turkeys shut down a stretch of road in New Jersey. They just marched into traffic and refused to move. And honestly, if I had to pick a spirit animal for the U.S. Congress that week, it was those turkeys. Loud, stubborn, and dangerously in the way. Now, behind the scenes, every single word spoken in public was being measured, clipped, spun, and blasted out in carefully worded emails. I got dozens. Subject lines like, the truth, or full exoneration, or sometimes just, did you see this, all caps? No punctuation. The tone of a person shouting through a bullhorn while juggling legal documents. Republican lawmakers, for their part, attacked the process, not the facts. They claimed it was all hearsay. No first-hand knowledge, they kept repeating like it was a mantra. But Vindman did have first-hand knowledge. So did Jennifer Williams, an aide to Vice President Pence. And they were next. Vindman, in full uniform, again calmly reiterated that he believed Trump's call with Zelensky was inappropriate. He said he reported it out of duty. No flair. Just that calm conviction that makes people either very reassured or very nervous. Williams confirmed what everyone suspected, that the call was unusual. Not criminal, she didn't say, but not normal either. And that was the theme of the entire inquiry, wasn't it? Not normal. That phrase echoed again and again, like someone trying to remind us of the baseline we'd quietly abandoned. Devin Nunes, the ranking Republican, took every chance to derail the narrative. He read statements like they were audition monologues and accused Democrats of being obsessed with overturning the 2016 election. His strategy wasn't legal. It was theatrical and effective if you cared more about rallying a base than finding facts. But facts were there, stacked neatly. Witness after witness describing a pressure campaign, describing confusion, describing fear. The picture painted was one of a government turned inward, where national interest blurred with personal interest, and career public servants had to choose between ethics and orders. One of the most striking testimonies came from Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union and a major Trump donor. He didn't look like your typical diplomat, more like someone who might sell you a yacht or an overpriced condo. But what he said that day shook the room. We followed the president's orders, he stated. That's it. One sentence. 6 words. And the entire building tilted. He admitted there was a quid pro quo. He admitted everyone was in the loop. Suddenly, all the previous testimony clicked into place. It wasn't speculation anymore. It was confirmation from the inside. Still, despite the bombshells, the public was divided. Some were riveted. Others were bored. Some tuned in for the drama. Others tuned out from fatigue. The question hung in the air. Would any of this actually change anything? Even members of Congress were doing math behind the scenes. Would the hearings move public opinion? Would they move poll numbers? Would they move senators? The hearings wrapped after 2 intense weeks. The facts had been laid out. The political stakes had been drawn. And behind the scenes, articles of impeachment were quietly being drafted like thunderheads forming on the horizon. But even as I walked out of the Capitol after the final hearing, I couldn't shake the feeling we were watching a trial without a courtroom. A reckoning without closure. And the next act, it would be written in the House Judiciary Committee. The articles are written. The air inside the House Judiciary Committee hearing room was heavy. not just with tension, but with the kind of hushed reverence that usually comes with funerals or final exams. It smelled like old carpet, fresh printouts, and quiet panic. Outside, cameras flashed. Inside, pens scratched. I had a front row seat to something rare, the writing of articles of impeachment against a sitting president. Now, this wasn't some dramatic movie scene with violins and soft lighting. No, this was bureaucracy wrapped in moral gravity and maybe a little coffee breath. It was December 2019. Just months after that infamous call, we were already here lawmakers poring over phrases like abuse of power and obstruction of Congress with the intensity of English majors on a group project. Every word mattered. Every comma could end up in a history book. The first article, Abuse of Power, this one focused entirely on the Ukraine scheme, the alleged attempt by President Trump to pressure a foreign government into investigating a political opponent for his personal benefit, using the leverage of nearly $400 million in military aid. Democrats argued that this wasn't just shady. It was an affront to the presidency itself, a fundamental violation of the public trust. Historians still debate whether this episode marks the most blatant example of presidential overreach since Nixon. Some say yes. Others point to different moments in history. But few deny the gravity of this one. The second article, Obstruction of Congress. Now this one hit differently. It accused the president of stonewalling the entire process, refusing to comply with subpoenas, blocking witnesses, and instructing others to do the same. Essentially saying, no thanks to checks and balances. I remember watching members argue over whether to include a third article, bribery. Some said it was cleaner to stick with two. Others worried they weren't going far enough. But in the end, they chose precision over drama, like carefully stacking dynamite but only lighting two fuses. Outside the room, the spin was already in full force. Democrats said they were defending democracy. Republicans called it a sham, a political hit job just months before an election. Trump himself. He was tweeting in all caps, of course calling it the greatest witch hunt in American history. Which, fun fact, is statistically incorrect. The Salem witch trials actually resulted in more convictions. And here's a truly bizarre historical nugget. During President Andrew Johnson's impeachment in 1868, one of the articles against him literally accused him of speaking too loudly and disrespectfully in public. Imagine if we brought that standard back today. Half of Congress would be impeached before lunch. Now back to 2019. Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler, who always looked like he carried a 1,000-year-old constitutional scroll in his briefcase, presided over the hearings with the patience of a high school teacher stuck in detention duty. He allowed impassioned speeches from both sides, even when they veered into performance art. One Republican lawmaker brought up Jesus. Another compared Trump to a victim of Stalinist purges. One Democrat quoted Hamilton because, of course, they did. The whole thing was equal parts civic duty and dramatic theater, like if Broadway produced a play called The Federalist Papers now with more yelling. By the end of that week, the committee had voted. The articles passed, straight down party lines. No surprises. But that didn't make it feel any less surreal. I walked through the halls of the Capitol afterward. It was strangely quiet. The reporters had left. The members had scattered. But the weight of what had just happened clung to the walls. For only the third time in U.S. history, a president was about to be impeached by the House of Representatives. I called a friend that night, a law professor who had been glued to the hearings. She answered with no hello. Just, they really did it. Yeah, they did. And now came the vote. The full House would debate the articles. It was ceremonial and historic, and frankly, already decided. Everyone knew the outcome. Democrats had the numbers. Republicans were locked in. It wasn't a question of if he'd be impeached, but what it would mean. When the vote finally happened, it felt inevitable, but also weirdly anticlimactic, like watching a balloon deflate slowly instead of popping. Trump was impeached. Again, just to underscore it, impeached. That word once whispered like a curse, now permanently attached to his presidency. But of course, the story didn't end there. Because in our system, impeachment is only half the journey. The other half, trial by Senate. And that's where things got cold, literally and metaphorically. January 2020. Washington, D.C. was gripped by winter, and the political climate wasn't any warmer. I bundled up in a scarf, gloves, and emotional detachment as I walked toward the Capitol. The Senate was preparing for trial, and every corridor echoed with tension. You could feel the chill, even in the radiators. And here's your weird off-topic tidbit for the day. At the same time as the Senate trial was gearing up, a group of raccoons was discovered living inside the White House press briefing room ceiling. I'm not saying that's a metaphor for the state of the republic, but it writes itself, doesn't it? The House managers. Essentially, the prosecutors were chosen. Adam Schiff led the charge with a small team of lawyers and representatives tasked with presenting the case. They were sharp rehearsed and aware that history was watching. But as I stood outside the Senate chamber that evening, I saw something in the eyes of reporters, staffers, even janitors, a kind of reluctant acceptance. The articles were strong. The evidence was laid out. But the outcome that was already written. Still, the trial would go on. The arguments would be heard, and America yet again would see if its institutions could hold, or if they'd simply bend a little more. Trial by Senate, truth on trial. The Senate trial began on January 16, 2020. I remember standing in line to enter the chamber, cheeks red from the cold breath fogging up my glasses, thinking this is going to be historic, or at least extremely weird. Turned out it was both. Unlike the House hearings, which had the chaotic energy of a cable news roundtable, the Senate trial was stiff, formal, and weirdly silent. Senators weren't allowed to speak. No phones, no snacking, no dramatic sighs or eye rolls. Well, okay, maybe one or two. They sat like students in detention, listening to the House managers and the president's legal team take turns making their cases. It had all the theatrics of a courtroom drama, but with none of the gavel pounding or dramatic objections. No, you can't handle the truth moments. Just people in suits reading from binders while the nation watched and sometimes didn't. Adam Schiff, leading the House managers, kicked off the opening arguments with the tone of a high school valedictorian giving a speech at a funeral. Calm, precise, painfully aware of what this all meant. His voice was steady, but you could hear the weight in it. He laid out the timeline, the call the aid freeze the pressure campaign, the obstruction. It was like building a Lego set labeled How to Undermine Democracy in 12 Easy Steps. Then came the president's team, headed by Pat Cipollone, and a cast of very serious men who looked like they'd been carved out of marble and Harvard degrees. Their approach was different, less about refuting the facts and more about declaring the whole thing illegitimate. He did nothing wrong, they said. This is a partisan stunt, they insisted. Also, even if he did it, it's not impeachable, which is kind of like saying, sure, I set fire to the house, but technically, that's just redecorating. Historians still debate whether this trial weakened the impeachment process permanently or just exposed how fragile the system already was. And here's something bizarre to chew on. Senate pages, the teenagers who carry water and notes to senators, were forced to wear latex gloves during the trial. Not for COVID, which hadn't yet hit U.S. headlines, but to avoid making any noise while placing glasses on desks. Imagine being 16, surrounded by the most powerful people in the country, and your biggest concern is not clinking ice. For days, the trial slogged on. Managers presented evidence late into the night. Senators scribbled notes or stared into space like exhausted statues. I swear one of them perfected the art of sleeping with their eyes open. Everyone knew the odds. A conviction required 2/3 of the Senate's 67 votes. Democrats didn't have them. Republicans weren't budging. Still, there was one wild card: witnesses. Could new voices be called? Would John Bolton testify? His book draft had leaked, suggesting he had first-hand knowledge that Trump directly linked aid to investigations. That should have been a game changer. But instead of sparking momentum, it sparked a debate about whether a trial should even include witnesses. Let me pause and let that one sink in. A trial with no witnesses. It was like holding a cooking competition and banning ovens. Republicans, led by Mitch McConnell, argued the House had already collected all necessary evidence. Democrats insisted the Senate should dig deeper. The nation, meanwhile, argued on Facebook over family dinners and Uber rides, and definitely in YouTube comment sections. The vote came 51-49. No witnesses. Just enough to seal the silence. A few moderate Republicans, like Mitt Romney and Susan Collins, wavered, hesitated, pondered. But in the end, only Romney broke ranks. When he stood on the Senate floor and announced he would vote to convict on abuse of power, it was jarring, emotional even. His voice cracked. It was like watching someone confess to a betrayal they hadn't committed. The chamber held its breath. Romney became the first senator in U.S. history to vote to convict a president of his own party. The backlash from his side was swift, but the moment lingered. It still does, like a whisper of integrity in a very loud room. As the final vote approached, everyone knew the result. Still, we waited. We stared at our screens. We watched C-SPAN like it was a suspense thriller, except the ending had already been leaked. Trump was acquitted. The votes 52-48 on abuse of power, 53-47 on obstruction of Congress. No 2/3 majority. No removal from office. Just a conclusion that sounded more like a sigh than a decision. Outside the Capitol, a few protesters waved signs. Inside, staffers shuffled papers and cleared the room. Senators gave interviews or sprinted away from cameras. Some tried to spin it as vindication. Others called it a sad day. And a lot of people just looked tired. And here's your off-topic fact for this leg of the saga during the impeachment trial. A therapy dog named Captain began visiting Senate staffers behind the scenes. Because apparently, even democracy needs a golden retriever on standby. So what did it all mean? The process had worked, sort of. The House had investigated. The Senate had tried the case. The system didn't collapse, but cracks had deepened. What counted as high crimes and misdemeanors now seemed up for interpretation. What once would have been a scandal was now just Tuesday. A president had solicited foreign interference, admitted it, and walked away stronger than ever. In the final hours of the trial, I walked past the rotunda. The statues of Lincoln, Washington, and Hamilton seemed to stare down with silent judgment, or maybe just polite indifference. This wasn't a clean ending. It wasn't even a satisfying one, but it was done, at least on paper. The consequences, those would come later, and they wouldn't be subtle. Acquittal and echoes still ringing. The morning after the acquittal, D.C. felt strangely hushed. Not the celebratory kind of silence you'd expect after a national decision. More like the kind of silence after a long, exhausting family argument where nobody really won, but everyone needed to go lie down. Coffee shops were subdued. Headlines screamed, but voices didn't. The country had gone through an impeachment trial, and the president had survived it untouched, unrepentant, and louder than ever. Donald Trump held a televised victory lap from the East Room of the White House. It wasn't a press conference. It wasn't even a formal statement. It was quite literally a campaign rally inside the presidency. He held up newspapers that declared his acquittal like trophies and launched into a speech that felt less like closure and more like vengeance. He called the entire process evil, corrupt, and bulls. Okay, technically, he cut himself off before finishing the word, but the message was clear. He had survived, and in his mind that meant total exoneration, vindication, permission. And yet, for a moment, I stood watching the screen and wondered, was this really over? Or had something deeper, more permanent, been set in motion? Historians still debate whether Trump's acquittal marked a failure of the Constitution or simply a painful, necessary stress test. Did it prove that the system works even if imperfectly, or that political loyalty now outweighed constitutional duty? The months that followed brought confirmation of the latter for many. Retaliation came swiftly. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, the decorated officer who testified, was escorted out of the White House. So was his twin brother. No public reason was given, just a quiet reshuffling that smelled like payback. Marie Yovanovitch, long retired from her diplomatic post, was smeared again by Trump and allies on Twitter. Adam Schiff became the target of relentless insults and threats, and yet the country just kept moving, as if we'd built an immunity to scandal, as if the impeachment was already being absorbed into the endless churn of content and commentary. News anchors shifted their tone. Analysts moved on to the next poll. A pandemic loomed quietly on the horizon, though we didn't know it yet. I think the strangest part was how quickly it all faded from public memory. For such a dramatic chapter, a phone call, a whistleblower, secret hearings, televised testimonies, constitutional debates, and a Senate trial, you'd expect a more lasting imprint. But maybe that's what this era taught us, that even the biggest political earthquakes settle into normalcy if you're bombarded by enough aftershocks. Here's your bizarre final tidbit. The day after the trial ended, a giant inflatable rat dressed like Trump popped up outside the White House, complete with red tie and gold hair. Protesters had named it Ratigan. It squeaked when poked. That's where we were constitutional crises met performance art. 21st century democracy at its most inflatable. But in quiet corners of Washington, there were conversations happening between staffers, between journalists, even between old rivals. Conversations about what had changed, what had broken, and what might never be repaired. Trust for one. Trust in institutions. Trust in the process. Trust in truth. There had been facts. They were presented. But they didn't matter in the way we were taught they should. If no one is held accountable, then what exactly is the lesson? There's a scholarly phrase I once heard in a law school seminar. Procedural justice only matters if people believe in its legitimacy. I didn't understand it fully then. I do now. And yet, there's also something remarkably stubborn about the American system. It doesn't collapse. It creaks. It groans. It threatens to buckle. But somehow, it keeps going. Not because of its design, but because of the people who drag it forward, 1 inch at a time. By the time March rolled around, the world had changed again. COVID-19 shut down the Capitol. Lawmakers gave speeches over Zoom. Impeachment became a memory, an artifact buried beneath masks and lockdowns. But the call, the one that started it all, remained frozen in time. In transcripts, in testimonies, in the echo chamber of American history. Trump would go on to be impeached again. Yes, twice, in one term, like a bad sequel to a movie nobody wanted in the first place. But that's another story. This one ends here. Not with a bang, not even with a sigh, just with the knowledge that democracy isn't self-cleaning. It takes work. It takes outrage. It takes whistleblowers and diplomats and sleepy senators pretending not to nap. It takes us. And in the quiet, in the waiting, in the echoes still ringing from that single phone call, I hope we were listening. Thank you for sticking with me through the story of America's first impeachment of Donald Trump, the one that began with a single call to Ukraine and spiraled into something far bigger than anyone imagined. From whispered concerns in secure rooms to thunderous headlines across the country, this wasn't just about one phone call. It was about what kind of power a president holds and how far he can stretch that power before the system flinches. It was about how we define truth, loyalty, patriotism, and accountability. And it was about how fragile those definitions can become under pressure. We watched public servants testify under oath. We saw senators sit silently while history unfolded in front of them. We read tweets that upended diplomacy and saw the rule of law compete with political loyalty in real time. In the end, the president was acquitted. But the verdict left behind something deeper than outrage or relief. It left questions. Questions about what we expect from our leaders. Questions about whether facts still matter. Questions about whether this kind of trial even works anymore. Maybe those questions are uncomfortable, but maybe that's the point. So, as you go about your day, making coffee, folding laundry, riding the train, remember this. Democracy doesn't live in hearings or transcripts. It lives in what we're willing to accept and what we're not. Let's keep listening. Let's keep asking questions. And when it matters most, let's be the kind of citizens who demand better. Thank you for joining me.